Attention! Tribunal!
Successful prosecutions for war crimes are rare and momentous markers of the past century's darkest times. At Nuremberg, the surviving Nazi leaders.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world.
The warmongers of the former Yugoslavia and the perpetrators of the Rwandan genocide. And now, if International Criminal Court prosecutor Karim Khan's request is granted, the next trials may be of those responsible for the war in Gaza. The leaders of Hamas for its murderous assault last October, and of Israel for what followed.
My office submits that there are reasonable grounds to believe that these three Hamas leaders are criminally responsible for the killing of Israeli civilians in attacks perpetrated by Hamas and other armed groups on the 7th of October 2023. I have reasonable grounds to believe, on the basis of evidence collected and examined by my office, that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant bear criminal responsibility. The crimes include starvation of civilians as a method of warfare.
Internationally, it's a huge blow for the Israelis. It's only going to reinforce the international tsunami of opinion that argues that Israel has been committing war crimes and needs to be taken into account.
Aaron David Miller is a former analyst and negotiator with the US State Department.
At home, in Israel, the impact, it'd be fascinating to see how it plays out.
אנחנו בעיצומה של מערכה על קיומנו.
Prosecutors won't be looking just at what happened on the ground. They'll take into account what the leaders said.
אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם.
Israel's rhetoric, I think, has left itself open unnecessarily. When you talk about siege, when you talk about cutting off all of the water to Gaza because they're murderers, or worse, you feed this sort of legal effort.
I think it's the right thing to do. It hasn't been a political decision. It's been one based on the law and the facts as they exist.
Retired Sydney magistrate Graham Blewett is a former deputy prosecutor with the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague, the precursor of the International Criminal Court. He helped prosecute former Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic.
We were told he would never be in The Hague, but he ended up in The Hague because he lost the elections in Serbia, and the political opponents were only too eager to get rid of him and send him to The Hague. There's nothing to say that something like that won't happen in respect of Israel and the Hamas leaders.
Mr. Netanyahu says the prosecutors' actions are absurd.
Mr. Khan creates a twisted and false moral equivalence between the leaders of Israel and the henchmen of Hamas.
Announcing it with the Israelis and the Hamas leaders at the same time, I think, provides some sort of balance and will be easier, in my view, to defend the position of the prosecutor to bring these indictments at this point in time.
Inside Israel, protests against Mr. Netanyahu are becoming more frequent and intense.
The growing consensus that the war is continuing in order to preserve Netanyahu's political position rather than for the sake of Israeli security. A sense that Netanyahu has abandoned the hostages, which is creating ever more public anger and protest.
Netanyahu's critics, his real critics, the ones who are never Netanyahu's, will say that basically this simply adds to the notion that the prime minister needs to go.
Just days ago, War Cabinet member Benny Gantz threatened to withdraw support from Mr Netanyahu. The announcement from The Hague has prompted his defence of the Prime Minister.
הצבת מנהיגי מדינה שיצא לקרב הגנה על אזרחיה באותה שורה עם טרוריסטים צמאי דם היא עיוורון מוסרי ופגיעה בחובתה ויכולתה להגן על אזרחיה.
Within Israel, the impact of the ICC's actions on public opinion are unpredictable.
Most Israelis do not consider themselves genocide heirs. I mean, they're prosecuting a war against a vicious terror organization. Israeli rules of engagement clearly have been expanded.
The original justification for the war is to defend the state of Israel against a hostile military force, a semi-state that invaded it and that continued to fire rockets at it. And I don't think that any elected government in any country in the world could have avoided going to war against such a force. The question is, even after the government made all the mistakes that led to the war, is all the mistakes that it has made in managing that war.
A panel of judges in The Hague must now decide whether to issue arrest warrants against the Israeli and Hamas leaders.
The mere existence of these arrest warrants, if they're issued, will prevent these leaders, the Hamas and Israeli leaders, from leaving their country. It's going to be even more difficult in the case of the Israelis because Israel is not a party to the ICC.
The ICC prosecutor argues that the court has jurisdiction over Palestine.
There is a legal obligation to surrender those Hamas leaders if they're arrested. But who will do that? Given the fracture between Hamas and the Palestinian leadership, it's hard to envisage.
If arrest warrants are granted, a greater challenge follows.
Since the ICC has no police force to enforce them, that individual governments would have to make a decision to arrest a sitting Israeli prime minister. So the whole situation is fraught, and I think it reinforces the fact that we are now in a huge strategic cul-de-sac with no way out. And the longer this continues, the more it's going to drive everyone to their respective corners and create a huge problem about how to even begin to reconstruct a realistic pathway for Israelis and Palestinians moving forward.
Tzipi Livni is the former Vice Prime Minister of Israel and a former Justice Minister. Tzipi Livni, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you for having me.
What is your reaction to the ICC prosecutor's request for warrants against the Prime Minister and Defence Minister for war crimes and crimes against humanity?
I think that this is an immoral decision. I hope that it will not be approved. You know that I am a long-time Netanyahu's political opponent, and I disagree with his policy. But any equivalence between this jihadist group that massacred, burned children, raped women, did deliberately promise to do it again, and a democracy like Israel is immoral and outrageous.
The ICC's argument is that there is no moral equivalency between making these separate cases. But let me understand exactly what you're saying there. Are you saying that an Israeli Prime Minister, because he's part of a democratic government, should be immune from war crimes prosecution judged by an independent court?
It's not only what I am saying. This is a basic role which is called complementary. And this is the base for the relationship between the ICC and national courts. As long as we are dealing with a democracy like Israel, but not only, with independent courts that can put charges and willing to do so against somebody within their country, including Prime Minister, that is acting against the international law, this is a place where the ICC would not intervene. Now, I would like to remind you that in Israel, I was part of those that took the streets and demonstrated in order to keep Israeli courts independent. And we succeeded. And you know, one of those that wanted to promote these judicial reforms are telling us, okay, you told us that if the Israeli courts are independent, it can help Israel's security. And look what happens. So it's not, I'm not saying that what happened to Israelis on October 7th is the excuse or a reason to do something like this to others. No way. But while they are acting deliberately, and we are trying to avoid civil casualties, although there are civil casualties during war. But there is no moral equivalence, like there is no legal or moral equivalence between somebody who killed somebody by mistake and somebody that, a killer, a murderer that did it deliberately and tortured his victims before.
Well, let me say this. 4 judges will now decide whether these warrants should go forward. Do you have any reason to doubt the independence of the judges and the process?
So the ICC, this is not a secret. The ICC is not just a court based that is dealing with international law. There are also some political reasons or I don't know, atmosphere that is unfortunately covers sometimes or shadows sometimes the decisions. But I do hope, it's premature, so I do hope that this will be the time in which they will look at the evidence. And I want to say also, to add something to this. You know, I am aware and I completely disagree with some statements that were made by Israeli ministers. I detest them. I think that I criticized it. I think that it was really outrageous. But I think that the role or the legal perspective should define or make the differentiation between some statements by politicians and the real policy or how the army is acting.
Well, let me, if I may, let me just ask you a question about that, because it's clear from the information that's already been provided by the ICC. They've given some detail about what they're talking about about murder and extermination of the civilian population, depriving the civilian population of the things they need to live, a whole series of very serious charges. I want to understand this from you. Do you accept that there are legitimate criticisms of the way the Netanyahu government has conducted this war?
Yeah, I think that there's a huge difference between criticism. I myself criticize my own government, not only for these outrageous, populistic statements, but on some of the policies. But at the end of the day, the Israeli army is acting in accordance to the international law. And we have also some examples from the past when Israeli soldiers acted in a way that violated the law, or when an Israeli civilian acted in a manner against Palestinians in a manner that violated the Israeli and international law. He or them were investigated and prosecuted. And therefore, it's not about criticism. It's about putting charges in the ICC that was established in order to give answers to horrific acts that are being made, like Hamas. We are dealing with Putin, Milosevic at the time. This is not the case.
Well, let me ask you this then. If Mr. Netanyahu has no reason to be afraid of the decisions he made in prosecuting the war, why shouldn't he go to The Hague and make his case if the judges grant the warrants?
Come on, we are. I'm not, the legal advisor to the Prime Minister. It's for Israel to make the decision what's Israel's next step. But as you are aware, the US and Israel are not members or didn't sign the convention that established the ICC, and therefore I'm not going to give advices from the balcony.
Well, let me ask you this question. Whatever you say about the ICC's action, do you accept that this is further evidence that Israel is becoming increasingly isolated in the world?
Yes, unfortunately. Unfortunately, yes. Before that, we still have the ICJ dealing with claims on genocide. And I want to reiterate, before we enter with boots on the ground to Gaza, we asked the population to leave places knowing that we are going to act there. And we wanted to minimize the collateral or the damage for civilians. And it's not only that. I see young people chanting from the river to the sea, and they don't understand that Hamas does not represent any legitimate cause of the Palestinians. I negotiated twice peace treaty with the Palestinians.
I think I just have to jump in there, because I think we need to make a clear distinction in our conversation between the allegations being made by the ICC. They do not deny Israel's right to defend itself. These charges arise from their determination that crimes have been committed against civilians in the conduct of that war. But let's stay with the politics at the moment, because, as you say, you're not here to decide the policy of the Israeli government. Now, Netanyahu is clearly under some pressure to step down. Will the ICC's decision make his position weaker or stronger?
I truly don't know. Listen, when I heard about the decision, I said, okay, this is immoral, it's unjust, I'm an Israeli, and this is where I stand. All the political, conversation, what will help Netanyahu or not, this is less important for me now. As his opponent, as somebody that completely disagree with his policy on other matters, including the policy toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I hope that we have elections soon and replace him and the other extremists within his government.
So finally on that, can you have a real debate when you deny the impact on civilians in Gaza of the conduct of the war?
I know, and for sure, civilians are paying the price, including in Gaza, as we did in Israel when Hamas decided to attack us. I'm not asking the world to turn a blind eye to the situation in Gaza, not at all. And I completely support any humanitarian aid to the Palestinians in Gaza. But the right comparison is not between the suffering of the people here and there, because the loss of a child for Israeli and Palestinian it's the same grief. But when you make your judgment, on one hand, you have this jihadist group that are deliberately massacre, rape, burn children, kidnap children and women that are still in their hands. And on the other hand, a democracy that is trying to do its best in order to avoid civil casualties while this is happening.
Tzipi Livni, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.